4:15 in the morning, the North Atlantic, 200 miles south of Iceland. The USS Gerald R. Ford was cutting through a heavy swell when the passive sonar array registered the distinct high-frequency whine of a torpedo propeller. The threat was already inside the inner defensive screen, a ghost that had bypassed $3 billion of acoustic sensors. The sea was a churning mass of dark iron under a freezing mist. The air on the flight deck carried the sharp bite of salt and the faint, metallic scent of cold Atlantic spray. Deep below the surface, a foreign military, Project 636.3 submarine, known to the international coalition as the Kilo class, had been sitting in a thermal layer for 36 hours. Its crew had operated in near total silence, running on battery power to minimize their acoustic footprint. The commander of the submarine had waited for the precise moment when the carrier's screening destroyers shifted their patrol pattern to account for the heavy weather. At a range of 4,000 meters, the foreign boat had fired a spread of 2 heavy wake-homing torpedoes. These weapons did not rely on traditional sonar. Instead, they were designed to sense the massive turbulence created by the carrier's 4 bronze propellers. On the bridge of the naval warship, the atmosphere shifted from routine watchstanding to controlled crisis in exactly 3 seconds. The acoustic signal was verified by the sonar supervisor, who shouted the contact report over the internal circuit. The commanding officer ordered an immediate hard turn to starboard and the deployment of the acoustic decoy system. The massive ship, displacing over 100,000 tons, began to lean. As its rudder deflected, the hull groaning under the sudden stress of the maneuver. The first torpedo reacted to the carrier's turn. Its internal processor recognized the change in the wake pattern and adjusted its steering vanes. The Nixie decoy, trailing behind the ship on a long cable, emitted a series of acoustic pulses designed to mimic a large vessel, but the foreign wakehomers ignored the sound. They were locked onto the physical displacement of water. 1,000 meters out, the torpedoes accelerated to a speed of 45 knots. The impact occurred 48 seconds after detection. The first heavy torpedo struck the port side, roughly 30 feet below the waterline, near the number 3 elevator machinery space. The warhead, containing 300 kilograms of high explosives, detonated upon contact with the outer hull. The explosion did not just tear a hole in the steel. It sent a massive shockwave through the entire frame of the ship. In the hangar deck, 3 levels above the strike point, 2 military helicopters were tossed against their tie-down chains, their rotors snapping like toothpicks. 4 seconds later, the second torpedo struck further aft, impacting near the seals of the outboard propeller shaft. This second detonation was more catastrophic. The energy of the blast shattered the main bearing housing and allowed high-pressure seawater to begin surging into the aft engineering compartments at a rate of 5,000 gallons per minute. Inside the ship, the sound was not a bang, but a deep, vibrating thud that felt as though a mountain had slammed into the hull. Lights flickered and died as the primary electrical bus in the affected zone tripped. Emergency red lighting bathed the companionways as the general quarters alarm began its rhythmic, mournful pulse. The damage control assistant, working in the central command station, watched his monitors turn red. The ship was already beginning to list 3 degrees to port. Automated sensors reported flooding in 4 separate compartments. The fire suppression systems in the machinery spaces had been triggered by the heat of the blast, filling the rooms with a thick, chemical mist. On the flight deck, the wind screamed through the radio masts. The crew, trained for years for this exact moment, did not panic. They moved with the mechanical precision of a professional force. Fire teams struggled into their heavy protective suits, while the engineering department began the desperate task of counter-flooding to keep the ship level. The naval warship, the most powerful warship ever built, was no longer a platform for projecting power. It was a wounded giant fighting for its life in the cold, dark water of the Atlantic. 4:20 in the morning. was no longer a stable platform for naval aviation. The ship had settled into a steady list of 5 degrees to port, a tilt that made every movement on the slick, steel decks a calculated risk. In the damage control central station, located deep within the armored citadel of the ship, the damage control assistant stared at a digital three-dimensional model of the carrier. 7 compartments were flashing a violent red, indicating total flooding, while another 12 were amber, signifying progressive flooding through ruptured ventilation ducts and cable trunking. The air inside the ship had turned thick and toxic. The smell of ozone from shorted electrical panels mixed with the heavy, cloying scent of atomized marine diesel fuel. Every few seconds, the hull emitted a deep, metallic groan that vibrated through the boots of every sailor on board. This was the sound of tens of thousands of tons of North Atlantic seawater, pressing against the internal bulkheads, testing the welds and the strength of the American steel. Damage Control Team 7, a unit of 15 specialized sailors, moved through the darkened passageways of the fourth deck. They were encased in heavy, fire-resistant suits and wore oxygen-breathing apparatuses that made them sound like mechanical ghosts in the smoke. The leader of the team, a hull technician first class, felt the deck plates beneath him vibrating with the force of the incoming water. They were moving toward the auxiliary machinery room, the heart of the flooding. When the team opened the final watertight hatch, they were met by a wall of freezing water that surged outward, nearly knocking the lead man off his feet. The seawater was a killing frost, hovering at exactly 34 degrees Fahrenheit. The room was a chaos of white water and hissing steam. One of the main fire main pipes, a 12-inch diameter copper-nickel line, had buckled under the dime, shock of the torpedo impact, and was now spraying high-pressure water across the compartment. The sailors worked with a desperate, practiced efficiency. They used hydraulic jacks and heavy wooden timbers, known as shoring, to reinforce the bulkhead that separated the machinery room from the main electrical distribution center. If that bulkhead failed, the ship would lose all power to the portside propulsion shafts, leaving the carrier a sitting duck for a follow-up attack. The sound was a deafening roar, a combination of the screaming wind through the hull breach and the relentless hammer of the Atlantic waves slamming into the side of the ship. Up on the bridge, the commanding officer received the report that the number 3 shaft had been locked down to prevent the warped metal from tearing the bearings apart. The USS Gerald R. Ford was now operating on only 75% of its available power. The captain looked out at the dark horizon, where the white caps of the waves were illuminated by the carrier's own emergency floodlights. He knew the foreign submarine was still out there, silent and invisible, potentially reloading its tubes for a finishing strike. The tactical action officer reported that Carrier Strike Group 12 was now in a state of chaotic transition. The screening destroyers, including the destroyer DDG-74 and the cruiser CG-73, were sprinting outward at 30 knots. Their sonar crews straining to find the foreign submarine before it could disappear back into the deep thermal layers of the ocean. The screen was no longer protecting the carrier. It was hunting. On the hangar deck, the scene was one of controlled emergency. Over 80 sailors were working to secure aircraft that had been shifted by the blast. A jet fighter aircraft had snapped its nose gear and was leaking high-pressure hydraulic fluid across the deck. The fluid was a bright, synthetic red, looking like blood against the gray non-skid surface. The hangar deck officer shouted orders over the roar of the ventilation fans, which were working at maximum capacity to clear the smoke rising from the lower decks. The ship's list increased to 5.5 degrees. The engineering officer of the watch began the delicate process of shifting fuel and ballast water to the starboard tanks to counteract the weight of the flooding. It was a race against physics. If the list reached 10 degrees, the carrier would no longer be able to recover aircraft, and the massive elevators would jam in their tracks. The naval warship was fighting a two-front war, one against the enemy beneath the waves, and another against the relentless weight of the ocean itself. 4:25 in the morning. The fourth deck, port side, frame 220. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Miller and his damage control team were wading through knee-deep seawater that surged with every roll of the ship. The air was a thick, suffocating fog of steam and pulverized insulation. The smell of burning rubber from scorched electrical cables was so sharp it cut through the filters of their oxygen-breathing apparatus. Above them, the overhead pipes were screaming under the pressure of the Atlantic Ocean, which was currently trying to crush its way into the ship. Through a jagged hole the size of a delivery truck, the chief petty officer of the watch had personal command of the primary response team. His mission was to stabilize the flooding in the auxiliary machinery room before the weight of the water compromised the structural integrity of the bulkheads at frame 240. The deck beneath his boots was slick with a mixture of seawater and hydraulic fluid, making every step a gamble against a heavy fall. The red emergency lighting cast long, flickering shadows against the bulkheads, making the compartment look like a scene from a nightmare. Miller signaled his team to halt in front of a watertight hatch that was bowing outward under the weight of the flooding on the other side. The metal was groaning, a low-pitched sound that vibrated in the sailors' chests. This was the red zone, the area of the ship that had taken the direct energy of the second torpedo impact. Miller knew that once they opened this hatch, there was no turning back. They were the only thing standing between the naval warship and a progressive loss of buoyancy that could eventually roll the ship onto its side. On the count of three, two sailors operated the quick-acting scuttle. As the pressure equalized, a jet of freezing salt water sprayed through the opening with enough force to strip paint. The team pushed through, immediately finding themselves in waist-deep water that was swirling with debris. A heavy steel crate containing spare parts for the number 3 shaft was bobbing in the water like a cork, threatening to crush any sailor caught between it and the bulkhead. The damage control team immediately went to work with Pone 100 portable pumps. These diesel-driven units were designed to move 100 gallons of water per minute, but against the torrent pouring through the hull breach, they felt like toys. Miller directed his men to begin K-type shoring. They used 6x6 timbers of Douglas fir, which expand when they get wet, creating a tighter seal. They jammed the timbers against the buckled steel plates, hammering them into place with heavy mallets. The sound of wood striking metal echoed through the flooded chamber like a series of gunshots. Every time the carrier rolled to port, the water level rose to the sailors' chests, the freezing temperature leaching the heat from their bodies. Miller could see the breath of his men hitching in the cold, their hands shaking as they tightened the turnbuckles on the steel shoring kits. One young sailor, a damage controlman 3rd class, was nearly swept away when a secondary pipe burst overhead, sending a vertical pillar of high-pressure water onto the deck. Miller grabbed him by the harness, pulling him back into the line. There was no room for error and no time for fear. The technical complexity of the capital ship worked both for and against them. The ship's automated valves had already isolated the major ruptures in the fire main system, but the torpedo blast had severed the fiber optic cables that allowed the damage control assistant to monitor the water levels remotely. Miller's team was now the eyes and ears of the ship. He keyed his radio, reporting that the shoring at frame 220 was holding, but that the water was beginning to bypass the seals on the electrical trunking. Below their feet, the hull continued to vibrate from the distant, high-speed revolutions of the remaining 3 propellers. The ship was still moving, trying to maintain enough steerageway to keep the waves from hitting the wounded port side directly. The sensation of the deck shifting under the weight of 5,000 tons of trapped water was a constant reminder of the stakes. If the shoring failed, the next compartment to flood would be the primary switchboard room. If that went under, the naval warship would lose its electromagnetic aircraft launch system, effectively turning the world's most advanced carrier into a tech-day, multi-billion-dollar barge. Chief Miller wiped the salt from his goggles and looked at his team. They were exhausted, their muscles cramping from the cold, but they had checked the initial surge. They had traded their sweat and blood for minutes, and in naval combat, minutes were the only currency that mattered. They were holding the line in the dark, beneath the waterline, while the rest of the strike group prepared to find the killer in the deep. 4:30 in the morning. The North Atlantic, 60 miles south of the Faroe Island Gap. The destroyer, DDG-74, USS McFaul was slicing through 10-foot swells at a sustained speed of 34 knots. The four General Electric LM 2500 gas turbine engines were screaming at 95% power, their exhaust heat shimmering against the black pre-dawn sky. On the bridge, the vibration from the four-bladed propellers was so intense that it rattled the coffee mugs in their gimbals and sent a constant, low-frequency hum through the deck plates. The air outside was a freezing mist, thick with salt spray, that crusted on the windows of the bridge in jagged white patterns. The destroyer was the lead ship of Destroyer Squadron 2's immediate response force. Its mission was the prosecution of the underwater contact that had nearly crippled the carrier. The commanding officer of the USS McFaul stood at the forward windows, his legs braced against the violent pitch and roll of the ship. Every few seconds, the bow would bury itself into a wall of dark Atlantic water, sending a massive plume of white spray over the bridge structure. The ship would shudder, hesitate for a heartbeat, and then rise again, driven forward by the sheer horsepower of its turbines. In the Combat Information Center, located in the dark, windowless heart of the ship, the atmosphere was one of clinical intensity. The blue light from the large screen displays reflected off the faces of 30 specialized technicians. This was the brain of the destroyer, where the radar system and the undersea warfare system integrated thousands of data points every second. The tactical action officer sat in the center of the room, his headset keyed to the primary search circuit. The sonar supervisor reported that the ship had reached the search datum, the last known location of the foreign military submarine. At the commanding officer's order, the McFaul transitioned from passive listening to active searching. This was a declaration of war in the underwater realm. The sonar technician's second class pressed the transmit key. Deep beneath the hull-mounted sonar array sent a massive pulse of acoustic energy into the water. The sound was a high-pitched, metallic chirp that carried enough energy to stun any marine life within 100 yards. It traveled through the water at 1,500 meters per second, searching for the telltale echo of a steel hull. On the sonar screens, the first few pulses returned only reverberations, the sound of the ping bouncing off the surface of the waves, and the uneven floor of the ocean. The North Atlantic was a difficult acoustic environment, filled with thermal layers and underwater ridges that could hide a submarine as effectively as a mountain range hides a guerrilla fighter. The sonar crew worked the controls, adjusting the frequency and the tilt of the sonar beam to look beneath the cold thermal layer at 60 meters depth. 5 miles to the east, the cruiser CG-73, USS Port Royal, was mirroring the destroyer's movements. The two ships were operating in a coordinated towed array sprint and drift tactic. While the McFaul hammered the water with active sonar, the Port Royal slowed to 10 knots, deploying its MFA-12 multifunction towed array, a mile-long cable filled with sensitive microphones to listen for any movement the foreign submarine might make while trying to evade the destroyer's pings. The internal radio circuit crackled with the voice of the cruiser's tactical officer. They had picked up a transient, a short, sharp sound that suggested a submarine's mechanical part moving, or a sudden change in propeller pitch. The coordinates were passed via the Link 16 data system, appearing instantly as a flickering yellow icon on the McFaul's tactical display. The icon was located 3,000 yards north of the destroyer's current position, sitting just above the seabed. The McFaul's commanding officer ordered a course change to 010 and increased the sonar pulse rate. The air in the Combat Information Center was dry and tasted of recycled oxygen. The only sound was the low, rhythmic chirpback of the sonar returns over the speakers. The sonar technician leaned forward, his eyes locked on a faint, brightening line on the waterfall display. The line was consistent. It was not a whale, and it was not a wreck. It had a Doppler shift, a change in frequency that indicated the object was moving. Bridge. Combat. The sonar supervisor called out, his voice steady despite the adrenaline. We have a solid active return. Target bearing 009, range 2,800 yards. Target is moving at 6 knots, heading 350. Depth is 200 meters. I have a firm track on a Project 636.3 foreign military submarine. The commanding officer's response was immediate. Master the track. Alert the Air Department. I want the military helicopter in the air now. We are going to fix this contact and keep him pinned until we are ready to kill him. Outside, on the pitching flight deck of the McFaul, the rotors of the MH-60 Sierra helicopter began to blur into a gray disk. The ground crew, battling 40-knot winds and freezing rain, pulled the chocks and chains. The hunter was no longer alone. The full weight of the military force anti-submarine doctrine was about to descend on the foreign boat. 4:35 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford was a landscape of wet, gray, non-skid, and sharp angles, tilted 5.5 degrees to the port side. The wind was gusting to 45 knots, whipping freezing Atlantic spray across the deck with the force of a pressure washer. Despite the precarious list and the constant heave of the ship, the carrier's air department was attempting a hot scramble launch of 2 MH-60 Sierra helicopters. These aircraft were the eyes of the fleet, and they were the only assets capable of fixing the foreign submarine's position with the precision required for a kill. The aircraft handlers, known as yellow shirts, moved with exaggerated care, their boots struggling for purchase, on the slanted deck. The first helicopter, call sign Trident 7-1, sat vibrating on the number 4 catapult area, its twin T-700 engines screaming as they fought the surging crosswinds. The pilot sat in the cockpit, his eyes locked on the pitching horizon, waiting for the signal from the flight deck officer. Because of the tilt of the ship, the helicopter's main rotors were spinning dangerously close to the deck structures, on the low side, requiring the pilot to maintain a constant, delicate pressure on the flight controls even before leaving the ground. The flight deck crews worked under the blinding glare of the emergency floodlights, their faces obscured by goggles and heavy cloth masks. The cranberries, or firefighters, stood by with high-capacity foam hoses, knowing that a single slip by the helicopter could result in a catastrophic deck fire that the wounded ship could not afford. When the flight deck officer finally dropped his arm and pointed toward the bow, Trident 7-1 lifted, off in a burst of spray. The pilot pulled maximum collective power to clear the edge of the flight deck, the aircraft banking hard into the blackness to avoid the carrier's massive island structure. Once clear of the ship, the 2 helicopters began a picket line search pattern 5 miles ahead of the carrier's projected path. The sensor operators in the back of the aircraft prepared to deploy their sonobuoys from the launch tubes located on the left side of the fuselage. These were long, cylindrical canisters filled with sensitive microphones and radio transmitters. The crew released a pattern of 12 active sonobuoys, creating a digital net in the water that the foreign submarine could not bypass without being detected by the multi-static sonar processors. At 4:45 in the morning, Trident 7-1 reached its first dip station. The helicopter transitioned into a low hover, hanging exactly 40 feet above the churning waves, its downwash creating a violent circle of white foam on the dark Atlantic water. The sensor operator in the rear cabin lowered the sonar sensor, a heavy, bell-shaped transducer on a long steel cable, into the ocean. As the dome passed through the 70-meter mark, it broke through the cold thermal layer that had been shielding the foreign boat from the surface ships. The return was instantaneous and unmistakable. The sonar system registered a massive, cylindrical, metallic contact sitting nearly motionless near the seabed at a depth of 280 meters. The foreign commander was playing dead, likely believing the Americans would be too distracted by the carrier's damage to maintain a disciplined search. He did not realize that the airborne dipping sonar had a direct, vertical line of sight through his hiding spot. The tactical coordinator aboard the dipping sonar helicopter immediately confirmed the contact at coordinates 61 degrees north, 19 degrees west. The information was passed via the Link 16 data system, appearing as a flashing red icon on the screens of every ship in the strike group. The destroyer, DDG-74, the naval warship, was already turning to its new intercept heading, its crew moving to their final battle stations. The Hunter had been found, and the wounded naval warship finally had the target it needed to begin the counterstrike. The air in the helicopter was cold, smelling of hydraulic fluid and salt, but the mood was one of grim satisfaction as the crew prepared to hand off the target to the waiting destroyers. 5 o'clock in the morning. The North Atlantic was a churn of black water and white foam as the destroyer DDG-74, the USS McFaul, moved into its final attack run. The tactical action officer in the Combat Information Center confirmed that the target was still pinned at coordinates 61 degrees 10 minutes north, 19 degrees 5 minutes west. The carrier strike group's air assets and surface ships had effectively cordoned off a 3-mile square of the ocean, leaving the Russian Kilo-class submarine with no room to maneuver without being tracked by the relentless pings of the dipping sonar. The coordination between the MH-60 Sierra helicopter and the destroyer was a display of peak American naval professionalism. Trident 7-1 maintained its hover, its sonar operator providing a continuous stream of telemetry to the McFaul via the secure data link. The destroyer's commanding officer sat in the heavy captain's chair, on the bridge, his eyes fixed on the digital tactical plot. The air in the ship was dry and cold, filled with the low-frequency hum of the 4 gas turbines, pushing the vessel through the heavy swells at 20 knots. Combat. Bridge. The captain's voice was calm, cutting through the tension of the room. We have a confirmed track on the hostile submarine. Weapons are free. Prosecute the target with a 2-weapon spread. The tactical action officer acknowledged the order and shifted his gaze to the weapons console. On the starboard side of the destroyer, the Mark 32 surface vessel torpedo tube trained outward, the triple barrels pointing toward the dark Atlantic. The trigger was squeezed. A violent hiss of high-pressure compressed air shattered the silence of the deck, followed by a sharp, metallic clang as the first Mark 54 lightweight torpedo was punched from the tube. The weapon hit the water with a massive splash, its internal thermal battery activating instantly to power the electric motor. 3 seconds later, the second torpedo followed, leaving a brief, white trail of bubbles as it dove into the freezing depths. The smell of auto fuel, a sweet and pungent chemical scent, lingered on the deck for several seconds before being swept away by the 40-knot wind. Deep beneath the surface, the 2 torpedoes entered their search phase. Their nose-mounted acoustic sensors began to chirp, sending out high-frequency pulses that searched for the specific signature of the Kilo's hull. The foreign submarine commander, realizing he was being targeted, finally broke his silence. The Kilo's propellers accelerated, the electric motors screaming as the boat attempted a desperate dash toward the deeper water of the Iceland Basin. The submarine deployed a series of acoustic decoys, small canisters that emitted a loud, buzzing noise designed to confuse the incoming torpedoes. The first Mark 54 torpedo was momentarily distracted by a decoy, banking hard to the left as it chased the false signal. However, the second torpedo's sophisticated digital processor recognized the decoy's artificial frequency. It ignored the noise and remained locked onto the massive displacement of the Kilo's steel hull. At a range of 500 yards, the torpedo's active sonar shifted to a high-speed pinging mode, the sound resembling a rapid metallic tapping. The warhead punched through the foreign submarine's outer light hull near the aft engine compartment, detonating with a force that generated a massive, expanding bubble of superheated gas. The primary explosion did not just rupture the hull. It sent a concentrated jet of high-pressure water through the internal pressure hull, shredding the main electrical switchboards and the secondary battery bank. The shockwave was so powerful that it could be felt as a sharp, vibrating thud through the deck plates of the USS McFaul, 3,000 yards away. The foreign submarine reacted with the violent, uncoordinated movements of a dying predator. The commander ordered an emergency blow of all ballast tanks, a move that sent thousands of cubic feet of high-pressure air into the tanks to force the boat toward the surface. The Kilo lurched upward, its bow breaking the surface of the Atlantic at a steep 40-degree angle. For 5 seconds, the black, whale-like shape of the submarine was visible. In the searchlights of the hovering helicopter, its hull twisted and venting a thick, oily plume of white steam. Then, the weight of the flooding in the aft compartments took hold. The sub's stern began to settle, pulling the bow back under the water in a slow, agonizing slide. A massive bubble of air and diesel fuel erupted on the surface, followed by pieces of shattered insulation and acoustic tiling. The sonar operator aboard Trident 7-1 reported a series of breaking up noises, the sound of internal bulkheads collapsing under the immense pressure of the deep Atlantic. Then, there was only the sound of the wind and the waves. The acoustic signature of the Russian Kilo-class submarine vanished from the screens. Black oil spread across the white caps of the waves, a dark stain that marked the end of the threat to the carrier. The hunt was over, and the USS McFaul began a slow circle around the debris field to confirm the kill. 5:15 in the morning. The dark, pressurized silence of the Iceland Basin. The Russian Project 636.3 submarine was no longer a vessel of war. It was a 5,000-ton cylinder of failing steel, accelerating toward the ocean floor 3,000 meters below. The hull, designed to withstand the immense pressures of the deep, was now a trap for its crew. The air inside the boat was a freezing mist of hydraulic oil and salt spray, and the only sound was the screaming of the internal support ribs as they began to buckle under the weight of the North Atlantic. At a depth of 350 meters, the Kilo-class submarine exceeded its maximum operating depth. On the bridge of the destroyer DDG-74, the USS McFaul, the sonar supervisor kept his headset pressed tightly to his ears. The active pings had stopped. There was no longer a need to search for a target that was clearly in its death throes. Instead, the crew was listening to the acoustic biography of a sinking ship. The sound was being recorded on high-fidelity digital tape for later analysis by the Office of Naval Intelligence. It was a series of sharp, metallic cracks, sounds that resembled the snapping of dry timber, but amplified to a deafening volume. The pressure at this depth was nearly 500 pounds per square inch. Every weld in the submarine's pressure hull was being tested by a force that no human engineering could resist indefinitely. Inside the Russian boat, the bulkheads were bowing inward, the paint flaking off the steel in jagged scales as the metal groaned. The secondary battery bank, flooded with seawater, began to off-gas chlorine, a toxic yellow-green vapor that filled the lower compartments. The crew, those still alive after the initial torpedo impact, would have been struggling in total darkness, the emergency lighting having long since failed as the main bus was crushed. At 420 meters, the submarine reached its crush depth. This is the theoretical point where the external pressure of the ocean exceeds the structural yield strength of the steel hull. It happened in less than a fraction of a second. The hull did not simply leak, it vanished. The force of the Atlantic Ocean rushing into the vacuum of the submarine was equivalent to the detonation of several tons of high explosives. The air inside was compressed so violently and so quickly that it reached temperatures of 1,000 degrees for a millisecond, before the freezing water extinguished everything. On the sonar screens of the USS McFaul, the waterfall display lit up with a massive white noise spike. The sound was a low-frequency rumble that shook the destroyer's hull even through 3,000 yards of water. This was the hull collapse transient, the final acoustic signature of the Kilo. To the trained ears of the American sonar technicians, it was a sound of absolute finality. There would be no survivors, and there would be no salvage. The submarine, its crew, and its remaining torpedoes were now a scattered field of debris settling into the silt of the ocean floor. The tactical action officer aboard the McFaul reported the event to the carrier. Ford, McFaul. We have confirmed a catastrophic hull collapse at datum. Acoustic evidence indicates a total loss of the hostile contact. The subsurface threat is neutralized. The air in the McFaul's Combat Information Center remained professional and subdued. There was no cheering. The sailors knew that while they had won the engagement, the victory was a grim one, measured in the violent deaths of 75 Russian submariners. But more importantly, the immediate danger to the USS Gerald R. Ford had been eliminated. The destroyer began to come about, its engines slowing from their high-speed sprint to a more economical 15 knots. The ship's primary mission now shifted from hunting to protection, as it prepared to rejoin the carrier's inner screen. Outside, the first faint light of dawn was beginning to touch the eastern horizon, revealing a sea that was still violent and gray. The oil slick from the destroyed submarine was being broken up by the heavy swells, disappearing into the white foam of the Atlantic. The smell of the ocean was clean again, the chemical bite of the torpedo propellant having finally dissipated. But for the carrier, the battle was only half over. As the McFaul turned back toward the wounded giant, the smoke rising from the Ford's port side was a reminder that the fire and the flooding were still very real enemies. The pressure hull of the Kilo had failed, but the hull of the Ford was still being held together by the sweat and desperation of its damage control teams. 5:30 in the morning. The interior of the USS Gerald R. Ford had become a claustrophobic battleground of competing elements. While the subsurface threat had been neutralized by the destroyer screen, the carrier was now fighting an internal war against a secondary fire that had erupted in electrical distribution room number 3. The torpedo shock had not only breached the hull, but had sent a massive electrical surge through the ship's primary power grid, melting the insulation on high-voltage bus bars and igniting a blaze that was now feeding on miles of synthetic cable jacketing. The air in the narrow passageways of the third deck was no longer breathable. It was a thick, yellow curtain of chemical smoke that carried the acrid, metallic stink of burning copper and the sweet, sickly smell of melting plastic. The temperature in the compartment had climbed to 300 degrees Fahrenheit, causing the paint on the exterior bulkheads to blister and peel away in large, blackened flakes. This was not a standard fire. It was a high-energy electrical conflagration that threatened the very heart of the ship's propulsion system. Damage Control Team 12, led by Chief Petty Officer Sarah Jenkins, was positioned at the primary access hatch. They were encased in heavy, gold-tinted flash gear and carried high-velocity fog nozzles connected to the ship's fire main. The sailors moved with a deliberate, heavy rhythm, their breathing ragged and loud inside their oxygen masks. Jenkins checked the thermal imaging camera, which showed a white-hot core of energy behind the steel door, indicating temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees. "Boundary cooling on the overhead," Jenkins shouted over the roar of the ventilation fans. Two sailors directed a steady stream of seawater against the ceiling of the compartment. The water hit the hot steel and instantly flashed into white steam, filling the passageway with a searing mist that obscured everything beyond 3 feet. They had to keep the steel from warping. If the overhead buckled, the fire would jump to the deck above, which housed the primary flight control auxiliary systems. The crisis reached a new level of urgency when the machinery control system reported a drop in pressure in the secondary cooling loop for the number 2 nuclear reactor. The flooding from the initial torpedo strike was no longer confined to the engineering spaces. It was beginning to seep into the lower pump rooms that serviced the reactor's heat exchangers. If the electrical fire reached the control cabling for these pumps, the ship would be forced to execute an emergency reactor shutdown, a scram which would leave the carrier dead in the water, and without any electrical power for damage control. In the damage control central station, the commanding officer received the grim update. The ship's list had stabilized at 6 degrees, but the combination of 5,000 tons of water and the intense heat of the electrical fire was pushing the structural bulkheads to their absolute limit. The decision was made to use AFFF, aqueous film-forming foam. This was a desperate measure, as the chemical foam would ruin the sensitive electrical components in the distribution room. But it was the only way to smother a fire of this intensity. The team at the hatch prepared for the burst entry. On Jenkins' signal, the hatch was cracked open exactly 6 inches. A jet of orange flame lanced out, driven by the pressure of the superheated gases inside. The firefighters met the flame with a wide-angle fog pattern, the water curtain pushing the heat back just enough for the team to step into the inferno. The sound inside the room was a chaotic symphony of destruction. The sharp, electric snap of high-voltage arcing, the roar of the fire, and the relentless hiss of the foam nozzles. The floor of the distribution room was covered in a foot of oily, gray water and chemical foam. The sailors thrashed through the mess, aiming their nozzles at the base of the burning cable trunks. The heat was so intense that it felt like a physical weight pressing against their chests, even through their protective suits. One sailor, a damage controlman second class, was struck by a falling piece of cable tray, but his teammates caught him before he could fall into the electrified water. For 20 minutes, the battle was a stalemate. The fire would retreat under the foam, only to reignite in a different corner as the red-hot metal ignited nearby insulation. But the military sailors did not retreat. They rotated teams every 5 minutes to prevent heat exhaustion, a constant cycle of fresh bodies moving into the fire and exhausted, suit-covered sailors stumbling out into the relatively cooler passageways. By 5:50 in the morning, the heavy black smoke began to turn a thin, dissipating gray. The white-hot glare on the thermal cameras faded to a dull orange. The primary fire was out. Chief Jenkins keyed her radio, her voice crackling with exhaustion. "Control, this is Team 12. Distribution room number 3 is extinguished. We are beginning overhaul and gas-free testing. Boundaries are holding." The cost of the fire was severe. 2 sailors had been evacuated to the medical ward with second-degree burns, and another 4 were being treated for smoke inhalation. More critically, the number 2 reactor was now running at only 30% capacity as the engineering teams worked to bypass the damaged electrical trunks. The naval warship was still wounded, and the Atlantic water was still pressing against its shattered side, but the ship had survived its second brush with total catastrophe. The giant was still breathing, even if its breath was now coming in short, ragged gasps. 6:15 in the morning. The hangar deck of the USS Gerald R. Ford had been transformed into a sprawling, high-tech casualty receiving station. The massive space, usually reserved for the maintenance of F-35 Bravo and F/A-18 fighter jets, was now a landscape of green canvas litters, rolling medical carts, and organized chaos. The ship was still leaning 6 degrees to the port side, forcing medical personnel to brace themselves against the bulkheads as they moved between patients. The air in the hangar was a sharp, nauseating cocktail of smells: the sterile sting of antiseptic, the metallic scent of blood, and the lingering, heavy odor of burnt electrical insulation rising from the lower decks. The medical department, led by the ship's senior surgeon, had implemented a mass casualty protocol 45 minutes after the first torpedo impact. 42 personnel had been brought up from the engineering and damage control sectors. Most suffered from blast overpressure injuries, smoke inhalation, or severe chemical burns from the ruptured fire main pipes. The team of 30 doctors and 60 corpsmen worked with a clinical, relentless focus, their movements practiced through hundreds of hours of simulated drills. In the center of the deck, a triage officer in a yellow vest directed the flow of patients, marking each with a color-coded tag that determined the priority of their care. Outside, the first true light of day broke over the North Atlantic, revealing a sea that remained angry and unforgiving. The wind continued to howl through the carrier's radio masts at 40 knots, making the task of stabilization even more difficult. To the east, the destroyer DDG-74, USS McFaul, and the cruiser CG-73, USS Port Royal, maintained a tight circular screen around the carrier. Their sonar arrays were still active, sending rhythmic pulses into the deep as a warning to any other hostile contacts that might be lurking in the dark. The kill of the Russian Kilo-class submarine had been officially confirmed by the strike group commander after the analysis of the hull collapse transient and the sighting of a massive debris field by the hovering MH-60 Sierra helicopters. The butcher's bill for the engagement was now being tallied in the ship's primary command center. 12 sailors were confirmed killed in action, most of them lost instantly when the second torpedo detonated against the number 3 shaft alley. Another 8 were listed as missing, their compartments currently sealed behind watertight hatches that could not be opened, without risking the buoyancy of the entire ship. The number of wounded stood at 34, with 6 in critical condition and currently undergoing surgery in the carrier's onboard operating suites.
We're live from the military
This was the reality of high-intensity naval combat. Even a victory against a modern submarine came with a price, paid in the lives of American sailors. Logistically, the USS Gerald R. Ford was entering a state of stable crisis. The engineering officer of the watch reported that the counter-flooding measures had successfully halted the increase in the ship's list by pumping 3,000 tons of seawater into the starboard ballast tanks and shifting 500,000 gallons of JP-5 jet fuel across the ship's internal piping. The engineers had brought the deck back to within 5 degrees of level. This was just enough for the massive aircraft elevators to function, though they moved with a worrying, metallic grind. The primary tactical concern was now propulsion. With the number 3 shaft shattered and the number 2 reactor operating at a reduced capacity due to the electrical fire, the carrier's maximum speed was limited to 14 knots. This made the ship a slow-moving target, unable to outrun a storm or a coordinated airstrike. The commanding officer of the carrier strike group ordered the remaining destroyers in the region to converge on the Ford's position, creating a steel wall of Aegis-equipped warships that would accompany the carrier on its long, slow transit toward the nearest friendly port. In the hangar deck, the sound of the wind was joined by the sight, rhythmic thumping of medical monitors, and the occasional hiss of oxygen tanks. A chaplain moved among the litters, offering quiet words of comfort to those waiting for treatment. Despite the trauma and the exhaustion, the spirit of the crew remained unbroken. They had survived a direct hit from one of the most capable conventional submarines in the world, and they had struck back with lethal precision. As the sun rose higher, illuminating the black smoke still venting from the portside scuppers, the sailors of the USS Gerald R. Ford knew the mission had changed from combat to survival. They were 200 miles from the nearest land, moving at the speed of a fast bicycle, but they were still afloat, and they were still the United States Navy. 7 in the morning, the North Atlantic, 240 miles south of Iceland. The USS Gerald R. Ford was maintaining a steady heading of 270 degrees. Its 3 remaining propellers pushing the 110,000-ton hull through a subsiding swell at a constant speed of 15 knots. The list to port had been reduced to exactly 4 degrees, a testament to the relentless work of the engineering department and the shifting of thousands of tons of internal liquids. The early morning sun, a pale and cold disk hanging low in the gray sky, illuminated the jagged hole in the carrier's port side, where the black scorch marks of the electrical fire rose toward the flight deck like a dark shadow. The immediate combat zone had been transformed into a fortress of military force naval power. Carrier Strike Group 12 had been reinforced by 4 additional destroyers and a cruiser, which had sprinted from their patrol stations in the Northern Sea. Overhead, an early warning aircraft circled at 25,000 feet, its massive radar dome scanning the horizon for any signs of foreign military, long-range aviation, or secondary subsurface threats. The air above the fleet was no longer empty. A combat air patrol of 4 jet fighter aircraft drifted through the clouds, their pilots keeping a silent, lethal watch over the wounded centerpiece of the fleet. The strategic objective of the engagement had been achieved, though the price of the victory was etched into the faces of every sailor on the ship. The foreign military submarine, a silent predator that had threatened the most expensive military asset in human history, was now a debris field 2 miles below the surface. The military forces had proven that even a direct, double torpedo strike could not sink a capital ship, provided the crew operated with discipline. The carrier's electromagnetic aircraft launch system was back online, and the number 1 reactor had been stabilized at 65% power, providing enough electricity to run the ship's primary defensive systems. The final report from the executive officer was delivered to the bridge at 7:15 in the morning. The butcher's bill was final and devastating. 12 sailors were confirmed killed in action, their remains being held in the ship's refrigerated lockers until they could be returned to their families. 8 more were officially declared missing and presumed dead, as their duty stations in the shaft alley remained sealed and flooded under hundreds of tons of seawater. 34 personnel were being treated for various injuries, with the most critical being prepared for medical evacuation by helicopter to the hospital facilities in Reykjavik, Iceland. The physical damage to the ship was estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The number 3 propeller shaft was a total loss. The bearings shattered and the hull plating around the exit point twisted into a nightmare of jagged steel. The electrical distribution room, number 3, would require a complete rebuild, including the replacement of 4 miles of specialized fiber optic and high-voltage cabling. Despite this, the structural integrity of the USS Gerald R. Ford remained intact. The ship was not only afloat, but was capable of defending itself and continuing its journey under its own power. In the Combat Information Center, the screens were no longer flashing red with incoming threats. The Tactical Action Officer oversaw a transition back to a modified state of readiness. The crew, many of whom had been awake for over 24 hours, began a slow rotation to allow for rest and hot food. The smell of coffee and industrial cleaners began to replace the scent of smoke and salt, a small but significant sign of the ship returning to its normal rhythm. The professionalism of the military sailors, often discussed in training manuals, had been forged into something unbreakable in the cold darkness of the North Atlantic. The commanding officer of the carrier strike group stood on the flag bridge, looking out at the escort ships that surrounded his flagship. He knew that the war in the shadows of the deep ocean would continue, and that the foreign military would learn from this encounter, just as the home forces would. This engagement would be studied for decades at the Naval War College, a case study in damage control, anti-submarine warfare coordination, and the sheer resilience of modern naval engineering. At 7:30 in the morning, the order was given to begin the long transit toward Naval Station Norfolk. The USS Gerald R. Ford, flanked by its shield of destroyers, moved westward. Across the gray expanse of the Atlantic, the ship was wounded, and its decks were quieter than usual, but its flag still flew, high from the island structure. The mission was accomplished. The threat was destroyed, the ship was saved, and the military forces remained the dominant force upon the world's oceans.